So in the previous lecture we covered how underglaze painted wares started in the early 12th century, developed from previous technologies. Here in this SEM image we see between the stone paste body and the alkali glaze is a layer of pigment, not a slip but a simple oxide pigment. In this case, chromium oxides, making a black underglaze paint. This is what we see being made from the early 12th century in Damascus. At about the same time, we see the luster potters of Beirut also making an underglaze paint. This, however, is a lead alkali glaze over a clay body. The glaze is made white by the growth of calcium silicate called wollastonite on the surface of the pottery. It is possible that this slip-like layer of wollastonite fixes the pigment, a black made of manganese oxides, and stops it running under the lead alkali glaze. Certainly the Damascus technique of painting oxides onto a stone paste body and then applying an alkali glaze became the norm that spread to the rest of the Middle East. Pigments included chromium black, cobalt blue, and an iron red. These colourful Damascus wares became very popular, being found across the Middle East, and soon they were also made in other Syrian centres. In Iran it took a while for the technique to be worked out properly. Here the chromium pigment is applied as a stone paste slip between the stone paste body and the alkali glaze, rather than as just the pigment alone. Eventually in Iran, as in Syria and Egypt, proper underglaze painted wares became popular and certainly were more common than the probably more costly luster wares. Meanwhile, in China, the taste was to more understated ceramics. This introduces a new glaze type to this lecture series. If you remember, there's a thing called an alkali glaze, which is fluxed with soda and potash. There is a lead glaze, which is fluxed with lead. There's a hybrid lead alkali glaze, which is fluxed with both lead and alkalis. There's also a tin glaze, and a tin glaze is not talking about the flux, it's talking about the fact it's made opaque with tin oxide. So now we also have a lime glaze, which has been fluxed with calcium oxide, and this is the common glaze type from China. So these are highly fired to stoneware and porcelain temperatures, and may be decorated by elegant incision into the body to create subtle designs, creating works of great beauty out of pottery. Then the Mongols came along, conquering China in 1271. The Mongols seemed to like colour, perhaps especially blue. When the Mongols conquered China, oh dear, here they come, they insisted on colourful pottery, like they saw in the Middle East. And so the potters of China, specifically Jingdezhen in northern China, made underglaze painted wares. Although it still follows a Chinese aesthetic, these motifs are thought to have been derived from Arabic calligraphy on some of the Middle Eastern prototypes. The source of cobalt was actually the arsenide of cobalt, which had come from Iran. Later Chinese cobalt comes from local sources. So these beautiful blue and white vessels, made with porcelain, eventually made their way to the Middle East, where they were copied in turn by the local potters. This one is made in Damascus. It's from excavations at the citadel of Aleppo in Syria, and dates to the destruction of the citadel by Timur in 1402. Timur came from Samarkand and conquered much of ancient Persia and he invaded India, Syria and Turkey. In good Mongol tradition, he took craftspeople back home from his conquests, and it seems that from Damascus he may have taken potters. The first Timurid pottery of Samarkand closely followed the pottery of Damascus that had been influenced by the pottery of Yuan China. But after 1420, one of Timur's successors allowed the craftspeople to leave. This probably included the potters, because they left Samarkand and set up shop in Nishapur and Mashhad, and eventually Tabriz. Nishapur was identified by analysis of wasters from the site. 2 vessels from Mashhad, including this one, had inscriptions saying that it had been made in Mashhad, and these were sampled. The Tabriz Petra Fabric was a bit trickier at first. The Petra Fabric eventually attributed to Tabriz did not look like a normal stone paste, although it contained relics of glass and inclusions of quartz. But the fabric was dominated by inclusions of felsic volcanic rock, possibly rhyolite. Hence it was hypothesized that this would have to be at a center in a location where felsic volcanic rocks dominated the local geology so much there was not a normal source of quartz. Also, the potters would have to have had a good reason to go there in the 1460s, which is when we thought they started making pottery at the site. A detailed look at the geology map of the Middle East suggested Tabriz. All of these rocks are felsic volcanics, and even these deposits are reworked felsic volcanics. So this was the only place on the map I could see that fit these criteria, and so it was looked then at what was going on in Tabriz, and it turned out Tabriz was the capital of a successor state to the Timurids in western Iran, and in the 1460s it was at its height, with construction of the famous Blue Mosque, here rather ruinous 400 years later. So together with underglaze paint applied to the surface of the pottery and then covered with glaze, there's also overglaze painted pottery. Luster wares are actually overglaze painted wares, but typically we're talking about wares painted over the fire glaze with pigmented glass, and then the vessel is fired again. Minai ware is a type of overglaze painted pottery made in Kashan, Iran, between about 1175 and 1200 or so. Kashan, you will remember, was also the production site of Iranian lusterwares. In this SEM photomicrograph of a section through a black and white painted region of a Minai ware sherd, you can see the white paint layer containing abundant tin oxide particles, and the black layer containing abundant angular chromite particles over the glaze containing tin oxide particles. So this is a tin glaze, and over this is the black, and over the black is the white. And you can see with the very sharp margins that these were not subjected to a great deal of heat. We also have in-glaze paint, which is on top of the glaze but sunk into it. This has come from painting an unfired glaze. After the glaze has been applied as powdered glass in a liquid medium then allowed to dry, the pigment is applied over the unfired glaze. These are 14th century sherds from Yemen painted in this manner. But actually some of the Minai pigments are applied in this manner, especially the blue. In this SEM photomicrograph of a section through a blue painted region of a Minai ware, you can see the blue paint layer containing cobalt has sunk into the glaze containing tin oxide particles. So you can see the margin is not as distinct, and it's just sort of the surface is bluer than the interior. So we have 3 main ways of applying paint onto glazed pottery. Overglaze painted wares are applied to an already fired glaze. They sit right on the surface of the glaze and sometimes actually stand proud on top of the surface of the glaze. They actually have relief. In-glaze painted pottery have the paint applied to an unfired glaze, and the pigment will sink completely into the glaze as it is fired. Typically, the boundary will not be very distinct between the paint and the glaze. Underglaze paints are applied to the surface of the vessel before the glaze is applied, and then the vessel is fired. So you have the pottery body, you paint it, you glaze it, you fire it. So, those are the main ways that the potters of the Islamic world and elsewhere painted their glazed pottery. Thank you.